100,000 Russian troops amassed on or near the border with Ukraine. Moscow and Washington both sticking to their positions in negotiations over NATO expanding to the east. Out of the west, headlines reminding us the stakes are high. And Russia's state-approved media, if not beating, at least tapping the drums of war. On the surface, it all sounds very 2014, when Russian forces invaded Ukraine and annexed Crimea. Only a lot of things have changed since then.
Absolutely, you don't have the sort of war frenzy vibe that you did in 2014 when the state TV hosts are really frothing at the mouth over Ukraine. And there are a few reasons for that. Firstly, the magic Crimea dust that worked so well for Putin and sent his approval ratings to record levels for a time, it's really worn off because the circumstances have changed. There's much more of a focus on rising inflation, falling incomes, and the pandemic.
This whole mess around Ukraine and around Ukraine's so-called integration to NATO is, in my opinion, connected to Vladimir Putin's internal popularity and his ratings, which are not very good. And it's funny how Russian state media covers the situation, because to them, the main goal is to cover anything except internal problems. Anything except the violation of human rights or killing the free press.
It's going back to the old playbook. It happened in 2008 with Georgia, right? And when you look at anything bad happening in Russia, whether it be its economy, whether it could be a wide range of things, the best thing to do is to ratchet up nationalist thought. And so if he can drum up rhetoric that will drive support for him in that regard, Putin will do it if it's not broke. Why not continue to use it?
The Russian president signaled his intentions on Ukraine last July, and not by conventional means. Rather than issuing a press release or holding a news conference, the Kremlin posted a 5,000-word essay that it said was written by Vladimir Putin himself on the historical unity of Russians and Ukrainians. That essay was posted in 3 languages, aimed at 3 audiences: Russian, Ukrainian, and English speakers.
Putin's essay was a history lesson about what he says was Ukrainian and Russian unity. But in reality, it was an essay of disinformation. Putin's language for unity is basically, we were united because we colonized you and because we subjected you to our power. It had nothing to do with their liberty and their choice. Throughout the centuries in which Kiev and Moscow has had a relationship, it's been one of Russia is here in Kiev and Kiev is there.
And President Putin himself, in his essay last summer, he wrote that Ukrainians and Russians are one people. So the Russian position is that basically denial of Ukraine's sovereignty.
Мы Россия, и Украина это часть России, и вы в этом скоро убедитесь.
This idea was floated by several Russian high-ranking politicians on Russian state television. They actually say, well, Ukraine, there is no such country, and it's just like a historical mistake that should be corrected.
The Ukrainian president, Volodymyr Zelensky, is a former comedian whose response to Putin's essay came laced with sarcasm.
Просто думаю, що ми постійно говоримо про нашу зустріч і на зустріч між президентами України і Російської Федерації зараз щось не вистачає часу у президента Росії. Я просто не знав, на що він витрачає цей час, і зараз я бачу результат.
Zelensky made his name playing a fictitious Ukrainian president on television before getting elected to the real job in 2019. Under Zelensky, Kiev has taken a hands-on approach to the news media. It cannot stop Russian news channels like RT from beaming into the country. But early last year, it took 3 Ukrainian news channels off the airwaves. 112 Ukraine, News One, and Zik were all linked to the same pro-Russian oligarch, Viktor Medvedchuk, a Ukrainian.
So I understand when you have a war with the country, you can't have the propaganda machine of that country in your home. Still, I think it was a mistake, this decision of Zelensky. I'm against any kind of shutdowns anywhere. I'm against shutting down RT in Europe. in spite of the fact that they are propaganda machine. This is not a democracy. This is not a European way of development. This is how the freedom of speech works. Well, I tend to disagree with this assessment because Ukraine is probably one of the countries of the world that is most heavily targeted by disinformation and propaganda, a part of Russian so-called hybrid war against Ukraine. So along with military tactics, Russia uses disinformation to weaken Ukraine's resilience and to weaken Ukraine's support in the West.
Zelensky's government was conspicuously absent from this week's talks on Ukraine's future, and not by choice. First, the Russians met with the Americans in Geneva, then with NATO in Brussels. As a former Soviet republic, Ukraine is accustomed to having its fate determined in distant capitals. This week's talks would have felt all too familiar. This is a 21st century story with a 20th century Cold War context that shapes the coverage and the terminology from the headlines on down. And that does the Ukrainian people no favors.
Let's think about the key negotiators. You have Joe Biden and you have Vladimir Putin. They are babies of the Cold War. So it makes sense for them to look at this political framework through that lens. So it's not completely wrong. You have reporters who lazily refer to that because that's something that a lot of Americans can relate to, right? When you look at TV, a lot of them are not millennials, right? And so you're going to use references that people can relate to, even though in many cases it decontextualizes what the contemporary issues are. So basically the challenge is, how do you move beyond that? It takes an intellectual and a political paradigm shift.
Well, I think this is how Russia wants to present it. And Russian rhetoric and Russian actions, they are aimed to frame all the debate around Ukraine in the context of a geopolitical struggle between the great powers. And that's actually worrying that the talks this week are held without Ukraine's presence. And that was Russia's goal, to exclude Ukraine. And the fact that the whole situation is sometimes portrayed in the media in terms of the struggle of big powers in this Cold War optics plays into the hands of Russia, because that's how Moscow would like to see it.
As for how this conflict will play out, one does not have to go back centuries, as Vladimir Putin would suggest, to see what may be coming. Or even back to the 1990s, when the Soviet Union fell apart. There's some more recent history made in 2008, another conflict between Russia and one of its former republics that provides a model that the Kremlin and its essayist-in-chief probably have in mind.
One thing you hear people mention a lot in Russia is the Georgian War in 2008, which was only 4 days long, but it was sufficient to essentially end Georgia's Euro-Atlantic aspirations. And what happened in Georgia after the war is very much what Russia would like to see happen in Ukraine. The sort of limited military campaign that takes out Ukraine's military capabilities, creates new facts on the ground, forces Ukraine to make more concessions. So ultimately, just like in Georgia, you have some sort of acceptable, Russia-friendly oligarch running the country, of which there are no shortage in Ukraine.